The Story 1. The Breathing in the Dark, a scary camping story. Subscribe to Another World for great stories to relax, study, or just enjoy. The tent stood isolated in the dense woods, bathed in the dim, fading light of dusk. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, the rustling of leaves whispering the secrets of the forest. I had come here to escape, to lose myself in the silence and solitude of nature. A solo camping trip had seemed like the perfect antidote to the stress of city life, the constant hum of traffic, the suffocating monotony of the office. I pitched my tent in a small clearing, just a stone's throw away from a stream that gurgled softly in the background. The chirping of crickets provided an almost comforting soundtrack to the peaceful isolation. As the sun sank lower, I made a modest fire, cooking a simple meal over its crackling warmth, content to bask in the quiet. By the time I finished my meal, the shadows had deepened, and the stars began to peek through the canopy of trees above. The thought of a calm night under the stars put me at ease, but a nagging sensation had begun to tug at the edges of my awareness. It was a subtle thing at first, just an odd feeling that I wasn't quite as alone as I had believed. I shook it off, attributing it to the natural paranoia that comes with being in the wild. There was no one out here. It was just me and the endless expanse of trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I took a short walk before nightfall, following a trail deeper into the woods, feeling the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. As I meandered through the forest, I couldn't help but feel like the trees were watching me, like they were old sentinels of a forgotten time, silent observers of the few who dared to venture this deep into their territory. The feeling clung to me, but I brushed it aside again, more determined than ever to enjoy my solitude. When I returned to the campsite, the sun had vanished entirely, leaving only the pale glow of my flashlight to guide me. As I approached my tent, I froze. Something was wrong. The flap of the tent was slightly ajar, though I had zipped it shut before I left. A chill crawled up my spine, but I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. Maybe I hadn't zipped it as tightly as I thought. Cautiously, I crouched down and peered inside. Everything was exactly where I had left it. My sleeping bag, the small pack of supplies, even the book I had been reading, all undisturbed. Nothing appeared to be missing. The air inside the tent felt colder than it should have been, though, and that uneasy sensation crept back into my chest. Still, I convinced myself that it was nothing, just the chill of the evening settling in. By the time I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, the fire had dwindled to a few glowing embers, casting faint, flickering shadows across the clearing. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the night, the soft murmur of the stream, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant rustling of leaves. And then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone breathing, low and steady. It was so quiet, so subtle that at first I thought I was imagining it. But as I lay still, straining to listen, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from outside the tent. It was closer, too close. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the flashlight beside me, clicking it on with trembling hands. The pale beam swept across the interior of the tent, illuminating nothing but the cramped space and my own belongings. But the sound persisted, a soft, steady breath, barely more than a whisper. I forced myself to take deep breaths, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe it was just an animal outside. But no. The sound was unmistakable. It was inside the tent. My pulse quickened as I checked every corner, every nook, but there was nothing. No one. It was just me. Alone. Or so I thought. The breathing continued, unnerving and relentless. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the sound itself, like the calm before a storm. I let out a shaky breath and reached for my bag, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain what I had just heard. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. I froze, pulling it out carefully. It was an old, battered walkie-talkie, one I hadn't packed. My stomach dropped. Where had this come from? The walkie-talkie crackled to life, emitting a low, static hum. For a moment, there was nothing but the eerie white noise. And then I heard it. A voice. Distorted, garbled, as though coming from a great distance. "I'm not your cat," the voice whispered, followed by a deep, rasping breath. My blood ran cold. I dropped the walkie-talkie as if it had burned me, staring at it in horror. The voice had been so clear, so unnatural. What did it mean? I wasn't your cat? I tried to calm myself, rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone nearby was messing with me. But who? I hadn't seen anyone for miles. And why would they break into my tent just to leave a walkie-talkie with such a bizarre message? Suddenly, I heard it again. The breathing. This time, it wasn't coming from the walkie-talkie. It was outside the tent. The low, steady rhythm of someone, or something, breathing, just beyond the thin fabric walls. My heart raced, the adrenaline surging through my veins. I held my breath, listening, hoping, praying that I was wrong. But no, there it was. Slow, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. I grabbed my flashlight, the light trembling in my hands as I pointed it toward the zipper. For a moment, I debated whether to open it. The rational part of my brain screamed to stay put, to wait it out. But something, some primal instinct, told me that staying inside the tent was more dangerous than facing whatever was out there. The breathing grew louder, more erratic, as if whoever or whatever was outside knew I was listening. My fingers shook as I unzipped the tent, just enough to poke my head out, the flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness of the forest. Nothing, no one. But the breathing hadn't stopped. It was still there, louder now, but I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, all at once. Panic gripped me as I scrambled out of the tent, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I needed to get out. Now. Without thinking, I abandoned my gear, my tent, my pack, everything, and bolted. I ran blindly through the trees, my flashlight swinging wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks, the shadows of the forest twisting and contorting around me. The breathing followed me, closer now, almost right on top of me, like it was chasing me, hunting me. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I kept running, the sound of that awful, ragged breath echoing in my ears. The words from the walkie-talkie repeated over and over in my mind. "I'm not your cat." What did it mean? What the hell did it mean? I didn't know how long I ran, how far I had gone. The trees seemed endless, the forest a maze of shadows and fear. Finally, when I thought I couldn't run any further, I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, the flashlight clattering to the ground beside me. Silence. For the first time in what felt like hours, there was silence. No breathing, no footsteps. Just the soft rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant sound of the stream. Had I outrun it? Was it over? I sat there for what felt like an eternity, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. Slowly, cautiously, I reached for the flashlight, shining it into the darkness, scanning the trees. Nothing. There was nothing there. I let out a shaky laugh, half in relief, half in disbelief. Maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me, played tricks on my mind. But then, from the shadows, I heard it again. The breathing. The story 2. The cry beyond the river. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the towering pines, casting long shadows over the rugged path of the Appalachian Trail. I had been walking for hours, alone, feeling the steady rhythm of my boots crunching against the dirt and fallen leaves. The solitude was what I needed, a break from the noise of life, the constant chatter of people and machines. Out here, in the vast expanse of wilderness, there was nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. As the trail wound deeper into the forest, I felt a creeping sense of isolation, the kind that, in the right light, could either comfort or unsettle. I chose to embrace it, telling myself that I was in control. This was my escape. Nothing more than a long walk to clear my mind, or at least, that's what I believed. It was around late afternoon when I first heard it, a faint sound carried on the wind, almost lost amid the rustling leaves. I stopped in my tracks, listening, straining to pick it out from the natural noises of the forest. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. A cry, high-pitched and wavering, like that of a child. My heart skipped a beat. A kid? Out here? I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. The trail was deserted, as it had been for most of the day. Still, the sound persisted, a pitiful wail that tugged at some deep, instinctual part of me. The part that couldn't ignore the idea of a lost child, alone in the woods as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I hesitated for a moment, weighing the options. There was no way a child should be out here, not without some sort of adult supervision. And yet, the cry sounded so real, so desperate. I couldn't just ignore it. Cautiously, I stepped off the trail, moving in the direction of the sound. It wasn't far, but the forest was thick, and the undergrowth tugged at my legs as I pushed through. The cries grew louder, sharper, like the child was in pain. My heart pounded in my chest, and I quickened my pace, fueled by a sudden surge of urgency. But as I moved deeper into the woods, something strange happened. The crying began to shift. At first it had been distant, coming from a clear direction. But now it seemed to echo from everywhere at once, bouncing off the trees and surrounding me. I stopped, turning in circles, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was impossible. The sound was disorienting, and with each step I took, it felt like it was moving farther away. After what felt like an eternity, I came to a small clearing and stopped to catch my breath. The crying had faded, now just a faint whimper on the wind. I stood there, listening, hoping for some sign, some clue as to where it had gone. But there was nothing. Only silence, thick and oppressive. I glanced up at the sky. The sun was sinking lower now, casting an eerie orange glow over the forest. I needed to get back to the trail before it got dark, but something kept me rooted in place. A nagging feeling that there was still something, someone out there. Lost. Alone. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. Someone was moving through the forest, coming toward me. My pulse quickened as I turned in the direction of the sound, my eyes scanning the tree line. Then she appeared. A woman, stumbling through the undergrowth, her clothes torn and her face pale with fear. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wide and wild like a trapped animal. "Please," she gasped, her voice trembling. "You have to help me. My daughter, she's lost. I can't find her." My throat tightened as I took a step toward her. "I heard the crying," I said. "I thought it was coming from over here." The woman shook her head frantically, her dark hair matted to her forehead with sweat. "No, no, she was here. I swear she was just here. I only looked away for a second and she was gone. You have to help me find her." There was a desperation in her voice that sent a chill down my spine, but it wasn't just her words. There was something else, something off about the whole situation. She was alone. No backpack, no gear, nothing to suggest she had been hiking out here with a child. And yet, she seemed utterly convinced. I opened my mouth to ask her more, but she had already turned, moving deeper into the woods, calling out for her daughter. "Sarah, Sarah, where are you?" For a moment I stood there, torn between the logical part of my brain that screamed at me to stay on the trail and the instinctual pull to help this woman. Against my better judgment, I followed her. We moved quickly through the trees, the fading light casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. The woman kept calling for her daughter, her voice growing more frantic with each passing minute. I stayed a few paces behind, my eyes darting around, scanning the forest for any sign of the child. But there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of anyone. After what felt like hours, we came to a river. The water was dark and sluggish, snaking its way through the forest like a black ribbon. The woman stopped at the edge, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was shaking now, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared at the water. "I can't lose her," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't lose her." Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. I took a step toward her, my voice low. "Where was the last place you saw her?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped into the river. "Hey, wait," I called, but she didn't stop. The water rose around her legs as she moved deeper, her eyes fixed on the far side of the riverbank. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to follow, the icy water soaking through my boots as I waded after her. But by the time I reached the middle of the river, she was gone. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. She hadn't gone under. There had been no splash, no sign of her sinking. She had just vanished, disappeared into thin air. I stood there, waist deep in the freezing water, my mind reeling. How was that possible? Had I imagined the whole thing? I scanned the far bank, hoping to see some sign of her, but there was nothing. Just the silent trees and the dark, still water. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. She was standing on the far side of the river now, just a few yards away. But something was wrong. She wasn't moving. She wasn't calling for her daughter anymore. She was just standing there, staring at me. Her eyes were hollow, empty, like she wasn't really seeing me at all. Her face, which had been so full of fear and desperation just moments ago, was now cold, emotionless. A chill crept down my spine as I realized that whatever I was looking at, it wasn't the woman I had followed. I took a step back, the water lapping at my legs, my breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. "What? What do you want?" She didn't answer, didn't move, just stood there, her gaze locked on me with that eerie, unsettling stillness. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the water and as far away from her as possible, but my legs felt frozen, rooted in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. And then, in the silence, I heard it again. The crying. The soft, pitiful wail of a child. But this time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from behind me, from the river. I turned slowly, my blood turning to ice as I saw a small figure in the water, just a few feet away. A little girl, her hair matted and her clothes soaked through, standing waist deep in the river. She was crying, her small hands reaching out toward me. "Help me," she whimpered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, help me." My mind reeled. Was this the daughter the woman had been searching for? Had she drowned in the river? But if that were true, then who What was standing on the far bank? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I was frozen, paralyzed by the horror of what I was seeing. The little girl took a step closer, the water swirling around her as she moved toward me. Her eyes, wide and filled with tears, locked onto mine. Please, help me. I couldn't think, couldn't move. The only thing I knew was that I had to get out of the water. I had to run. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I turned and bolted for the riverbank, my legs churning through the freezing water. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see what was behind me. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached the bank, I scrambled up onto the shore, collapsing onto the ground, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. For a long moment, I lay there, gasping for breath, my mind racing with what I had just witnessed. Eventually, I forced myself to look back at the river. The woman was gone. The little girl, too. The water was still and dark, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't just in my head. I had been alone when I started this hike, but I wasn't alone anymore. Something had followed me, something that wasn't human. I didn't stop running until I was miles away from the river, my legs aching and my lungs burning. And even then, I didn't feel safe. I never went back to the Appalachian Trail after that day, and I never spoke of what I saw. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear it, the soft cry of a child, echoing in the distance. The story. 3. The Clown in the Woods. The air was crisp that night in late October 2016. I could feel it prickling my skin as I stretched my legs at the edge of the large nature preserve near my home. The place had always been a refuge for me, a sprawling expanse of dense woods and winding trails, far enough from the city to offer real peace. I'd been coming here for years to run, to lose myself in the steady rhythm of my feet, hitting the ground and the way the trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out everything but the path ahead. It was dark, sure, but I'd run here in the dark dozens of times. I knew the trails like the back of my hand. Every bend, every dip, every twist and turn. Nothing to worry about. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Earlier that week, a body had been found in the preserve. A jogger, like me, had stumbled upon it near the creek that cut through the northern section. The news said it had been there for weeks, half buried in the leaves and dirt, decomposed beyond recognition. But things like that happen, don't they? People die. Accidents, crimes of opportunity. And sure, it was unsettling. But that was miles from where I planned to run tonight. It was a big park. Besides, where I lived had always felt safe, the kind of town where people didn't lock their doors. And the biggest crime wave was a string of mailbox vandalisms by bored high schoolers. I had no reason to think anything could go wrong. I pulled my earbuds from my pocket and slipped them in, firing up my usual running playlist. The music drowned out the whispers of the night around me, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the soft hoot of an owl somewhere in the distance. I set off, keeping a steady pace as the trail led me deeper into the woods. For the first mile, everything was normal. My breath fell into a rhythm. My heart beat steady in my chest. The cool air filled my lungs, and I felt that familiar sense of peace wash over me. The trail was narrow but well-worn, the dirt packed from years of use. The trees on either side of me were tall and thick, casting long, twisted shadows in the moonlight. But then, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a sense that something was off. The music in my ears seemed too loud, too jarring against the quiet stillness of the night. I pulled out one of my earbuds, letting it dangle, and listened. The sound of my footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally, like there was something or someone else moving in sync with me. I stopped, breathing heavily, and turned slowly in a circle, scanning the woods around me. Nothing. Just trees, standing like silent sentinels in the dark. The path behind me stretched into the shadows, empty and still. I laughed at myself, feeling a little ridiculous for getting spooked over nothing. But then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, behind one of the trees to my left, there was movement. A flicker of something tall, something out of place. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to face it. At first, it was just a shape, too far away to make out clearly, but unmistakably there, tall, human. And then it stepped out from behind the tree. It was a clown. Not just any clown, though. This one looked like it had been pulled from the worst nightmare imaginable. Its face was smeared with white and red paint, the colors bleeding into each other like it had been hastily applied. The eyes were black hollows, empty and soulless, and the mouth stretched into a grotesque permanent grin. It wore a tattered, oversized costume, the fabric stained and torn, hanging loosely from its thin frame. But it wasn't the face that made my blood run cold. It was the weapon. In its hand was a long metal pipe, and at the end of the pipe were jagged, rusty nails sticking out in all directions like some medieval torture device. The clown held it loosely, swinging it back and forth as if testing its weight. For a moment I couldn't move. I was frozen, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear the wind rustling through the trees. The clown took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it knew it had all the time in the world. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step back, and then another. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were encased in concrete. The clown stopped, tilting its head slightly to the side, as if it were studying me, waiting to see what I would do. And then, with agonizing slowness, it lifted the metal pipe, pointing it directly at me. That was all it took. My body snapped into action, and I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the dirt path. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I tore through the woods, the trees blurring together in my peripheral vision. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs aching, the sound of my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I could hear it behind me, the soft, deliberate crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot, the slow but steady pursuit of the clown. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. It knew I was terrified. It knew I would tire out eventually. The trail twisted and turned, but I barely registered it. I just kept moving, my only thought to get as far away from that thing as possible. But the woods were like a labyrinth, and I had no sense of direction. I had no idea how far I'd gone, how close I was to the main road, or if I was just running deeper into the preserve. At some point, I veered off the trail entirely, crashing through the undergrowth, branches scratching at my face and arms. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a second, I lay there, gasping for breath, pain shooting through my ankle. But I didn't have time to be hurt. I forced myself to my feet, wincing as I put weight on my injured ankle. And that's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of laughter. It started low and quiet, a soft giggle that sent a chill down my spine. But it grew louder, more manic, until it echoed through the trees like a chorus of mocking voices. The clown was laughing at me. I stumbled forward, my heart racing as I scanned the woods around me, desperate for any sign of escape. But the trees were thick, the shadows impenetrable. There was no way out. I was trapped. The laughter stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence. My breath caught in my throat as I turned in a slow circle, my eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. But the clown was gone. Or at least, I couldn't see it. A twig snapped behind me and I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was nothing, just the empty woods. The air was still, the night unnervingly quiet. I backed up slowly, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to run. But where would I go? I was lost, disoriented, and I knew that thing was still out there, somewhere, watching me. Another snap. Closer this time. I turned just in time to see the clown step out from behind a tree, no more than 10 feet away. It wasn't smiling anymore. Its face was twisted into a grotesque sneer, the black eyes glittering with malice. The metal pipe in its hand gleamed in the moonlight, the nails catching the light as it swung the weapon slowly back and forth. I bolted. Pain shot through my ankle with every step, but I didn't care. I had to keep moving. I had to get away. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear it behind me. The slow, deliberate footsteps, the soft giggle, the low rasp of its breath. I don't know how long I ran, how far I went. Time lost all meaning. The only thing that mattered was the overwhelming need to escape. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more hopeless it felt. The trees seemed to close in around me, the path disappearing into a maze of shadows and undergrowth. Eventually, my legs gave out, and I collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath. My vision blurred, my head spinning with exhaustion and fear. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't keep going. I was done. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The woods were still, the air thick with tension, and then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard it again. The laughter. Low and soft, like it was just waiting for me to give up. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, trying to think, but my mind was a whirlwind of panic. There was no way out. No one was coming to save me. I was alone. When I opened my eyes again, the clown was standing in front of me. It had stopped smiling. Its face was a mask of cold, silent rage, the metal pipe gripped tightly in its hand. I backed up slowly, pressing myself against the tree, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" I croaked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The clown didn't answer. It just stood there, staring at me with those empty black eyes. And then, in one swift motion, it raised the pipe, the nails gleaming in the moonlight. I screamed. I'm not sure what happened next. Maybe it was the adrenaline, maybe it was sheer dumb luck, but I somehow managed to push myself off the ground and start running again. My ankle screamed in protest, but I didn't care. I just ran, my mind blank with terror, my body fueled by the primal instinct to survive. I don't know how I made it out of the woods. I don't even remember the moment I broke through the trees and onto the main road. All I know is that when I did, I collapsed in a heap, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I was found hours later by a passing car, disoriented and babbling incoherently about a clown with a pipe full of nails. They didn't believe me, of course. Who would? I wouldn't have believed it either if it hadn't happened to me. The police searched the preserve, but they didn't find anything. No clown, no weapon, nothing to suggest that anyone had been out there but me. But I know what I saw. I know what happened, and I haven't gone back to that nature preserve since. The story. 4. The Watcher in the Woods. Working at a summer camp wasn't something I had planned on, but when I found myself between jobs in the summer of 2016, it seemed like the perfect way to escape the suffocating heat of the city and get a paycheck. Camp Green Hollow, nestled deep in the forest of the Pacific Northwest, was picturesque. Everything you'd imagine from a postcard. The air was cool and crisp, the trees towering and dense, and the lake sparkled under the summer sun. The kids arrived in early June and things got busy fast. Days were packed with activities: swimming, hiking, canoeing. By nightfall, we were usually too tired to do anything other than crash in our bunks. But there were nights when a few of us, mainly myself, Danny, and Erica, would slip away for a smoke after curfew. Camp policy was strict about smoking, but everyone had their vices. The kids never knew, and the counselors were discreet. The spot we'd chosen was a small clearing about a 10-minute walk from the cabins, deep enough into the woods that the glow of the campfire couldn't be seen. The trees there grew so thick and tall that they swallowed the sound of the camp behind us, leaving nothing but the rustle of leaves and the occasional owl hooting in the distance. One Friday night, around mid-July, the three of us headed out there after lights out. The air was cool and the sky was a blanket of stars, with no moon to soften the darkness. Danny had a pack of Marlboros, and Erica had smuggled in a couple of beers, which we passed around in the dim glow of our cell phone flashlights. We'd just finished the first round of smokes when Erica stopped mid-laugh, her face growing serious as she looked over my shoulder. "Did you hear that?" I paused, cigarette halfway to my lips. "Hear what?" She squinted into the trees, her breath shallow. I thought I heard something moving, like footsteps." Danny, ever the joker, let out an exaggerated gasp. "Oh no, it's Bigfoot! Run for your lives!" Erica rolled her eyes, but I saw the tension in her face. I strained to listen. The woods were quiet, but then I heard it too. Faint, a crackling sound, like dry branches snapping underfoot. My skin prickled, but I forced a laugh. "It's probably just a deer or something. Relax." "Yeah, probably," Erica muttered, but she didn't look convinced. We all fell silent for a few minutes, smoking quietly and listening to the night. Then came the light. It was fast, like a camera flash, but so bright that it left spots dancing in front of my eyes. It lit up the clearing for less than a second before everything was plunged back into darkness. "What the hell was that?" Danny said, his voice no longer joking. None of us answered right away. We stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where the flash had come from. The woods were still again, but now the quiet felt oppressive, like something was watching us. "Maybe it was lightning?" Erica whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. There hadn't been a cloud in the sky all day. Danny took a step toward the trees, squinting into the darkness. "Maybe we should—" He never finished the sentence. There was a loud crack, and this time it wasn't distant. It was right behind us. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, tall and still. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. I wasn't one for superstition, but something about the atmosphere had changed, and I didn't like it. Danny nodded, and without another word, we snuffed out the cigarettes, crushed the beer cans, and started back toward camp. The walk back felt longer than usual. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch made us jumpy. But when we finally emerged from the woods and saw the flickering light of the campfire near the lake, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. We made our way to the cabins without incident, and soon enough, I was back in my bunk, pulling my sleeping bag over my head to block out the eerie feeling still clinging to me. I didn't think much of it the next day. The kids kept us busy, and by lunch, the weirdness of the night before had been pushed to the back of my mind. It wasn't until I was on my way to the dining hall later that evening that the unease came flooding back. I had just crossed the gravel path leading to the mess hall when I saw it. A face, peering out from behind the door of the canteen, watching me. At first, I thought it was one of the other counselors messing around, but something about the way it moved, slow, deliberate, froze me in place. It was there, and then it wasn't. Just gone, like a shadow slipping into the corner of my eye. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, my heart thudding in my chest. There was no way it had been one of the other counselors. The kids were all inside the hall, and none of the counselors I knew would pull a prank like that. I forced myself to walk into the canteen, but my eyes kept darting to the door, half expecting to see the face again. But it didn't come back, and the rest of the night went on without incident. The next couple of days passed in a blur of activities, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. I kept catching glimpses, out of the corner of my eye, or reflected in the window of the cabin at night. But every time I looked directly, there was nothing there. Then came Wednesday night. I was alone in the counselor's cabin, trying to finish up some paperwork after the kids had gone to bed. The others were down by the lake, having some kind of impromptu party for Erica's birthday. I wasn't in the mood to join them. My mind was still racing from everything that had happened. It was just after midnight when I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. My hand froze over the paperwork, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping came again, louder this time. I turned slowly in my chair, dread pooling in my stomach. There, just beyond the glass, was a figure. The first thing I noticed was the hand, pressed against the window pane, pale and thin. The second thing was the face. No, not a face. A silhouette, barely visible in the faint glow of the moonlight. The figure was standing just outside, staring in at me. And then, slowly, almost mockingly, it raised its other hand and waved. I scrambled back, my chair clattering to the floor as I stood. My heart was hammering in my chest, panic overtaking me. I blinked, and in that split second, the figure was gone. I rushed to the window, throwing it open, but there was nothing, just the empty yard, bathed in the cold light of the moon. I barely slept that night. Every creak, every gust of wind had me jumping at shadows. When morning finally came, I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, my imagination playing tricks on me. But I knew better. Something wasn't right. The next few days dragged by, and I found myself counting down the hours until the end of the week when my shift at camp would be over. I wasn't sure if I could handle another night in that cabin, alone with whatever was watching me. Then, on the last day, just as I was packing up to leave, it happened. I was sitting in my car, ready to pull out of the lot, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number with a single attachment. Curious, I opened it. It was a photo of me, walking out of the woods that night with Danny and Erica. There was another one, me standing by the canteen, looking at the door. And then another, me in my cabin, at my desk, the figure visible through the window behind me. My stomach turned as I scrolled through the photos, each one documenting a moment I hadn't realized was being watched. The last one was the worst. It was a close-up of my car, taken just minutes before. The angle was perfect, capturing the back of my car, my license plate in clear view. I looked up, scanning the parking lot, but there was no one. My heart raced, and I threw the phone onto the passenger seat, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I floored the gas pedal, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the dirt road leading out of camp. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, my pulse still thudding in my ears. I never went back to Camp Green Hollow. I didn't tell Danny or Erica what had happened. I didn't tell anyone. But even now, years later, I still check my rearview mirror more often than I should. Because whoever or whatever was watching me that summer, I don't think they've stopped. The Story 5. The Stranger in Savannah's Closet. The summer heat clung to everything that night, thick and sticky, even as the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. It was the 4th of July in 2017, and the sounds of fireworks echoed through the small town of Fairmont like distant gunshots. Red, white, and blue lit up the night sky, bursting in sporadic, dazzling displays above the treetops. For most, it was a night of celebration, barbecues, sparklers, and laughter filling the air. But for Eli and me, it had become something else entirely. Eli and I had been friends since we were kids, the kind of friends who shared everything: bad grades, dumb jokes, first crushes. By the time high school rolled around, we were inseparable. But that summer, the summer before our senior year, Eli had become obsessed with one thing: Savannah Hughes. Savannah was the kind of girl everyone knew. Blonde, always surrounded by a group of giggling friends, and seemingly untouchable. She had this effortless cool about her that made every guy want her and every girl want to be her. And Eli? He was no exception. He'd been infatuated with her since the 8th grade. But she barely knew we existed. It was Eli's idea to prank her. In retrospect, it was the stupidest plan imaginable. Sneaking into the house of one of the most popular girls in school on the night of the biggest holiday in town? We were asking for trouble. But Eli had convinced me with that grin of his, and a 6-pack of beers he'd swiped from his older brother's stash. "We'll just scare her," he'd said. "It'll be funny." So, we found ourselves creeping through the back streets of Fairmont, heading toward Savannah's house on the outskirts of town. The air was buzzing with the sound of fireworks, masking the crunch of gravel under our feet as we walked. My gut was already churning with nerves, but Eli seemed cool as ever, a mischievous glint in his eye. Savannah's house was big, too big for a town like ours, really. It was one of those old Victorian places, all steep gables and towering windows, with a wraparound porch that looked like something out of a Gothic novel. The lights were off, and the house sat in eerie silence, the distant crackle of fireworks the only noise breaking the night. We crept up to the side of the house, careful to stay in the shadows. "She's at some party tonight," Eli whispered. "We'll be in and out before anyone knows." I should have turned back then. Something about the house, the stillness of it, set my teeth on edge. But I followed Eli up to the back door, the beer buzz dulling my sense of reason. The door was unlocked. Savannah's family had money, but they'd always been lax about things like security. Eli pushed the door open with a soft creak, and we stepped inside. The air was cool and musty, the faint smell of old wood and dust clinging to the walls. The house was dark, the only light coming from the distant flashes of fireworks through the windows. We crept through the kitchen, our footsteps barely audible on the worn wooden floors. My heart was pounding, but Eli seemed as calm as ever. He led the way, moving through the house with the confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times before. The plan was simple. We'd sneak into Savannah's room, leave some harmless prank, a fake spider in her bed, maybe, or a creepy note, and slip out before anyone was the wiser. It was dumb, but it was supposed to be harmless. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. We made our way up the creaky staircase, the silence of the house pressing in on us. Every step seemed louder than the last, echoing in the empty halls. When we reached the second floor, Eli paused, glancing around to make sure we were alone. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the tension thick between us. "Her room's down the hall," Eli whispered, pointing toward a closed door at the far end. We moved quickly, our nerves getting the better of us. The door to Savannah's room creaked as Eli pushed it open, revealing a large bedroom, neatly kept. The moonlight filtered in through the curtains, casting pale beams across the bed and floor. "Let's just do this and get out of here," I muttered, my anxiety climbing with every passing second. Eli grinned, pulling a plastic spider from his pocket and placing it carefully on Savannah's pillow. I almost laughed at how ridiculous the whole thing was, breaking into someone's house just to leave a toy spider. But then Eli froze, his face going pale as his eyes locked on the closet across the room. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it. The closet door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see someone standing inside. Tall, motionless, watching us. My heart stopped, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. It wasn't Savannah. It wasn't anyone we knew. Eli, I whispered, but he was already moving, backing toward the door. We need to go. But before we could even turn, we heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway outside. Someone was in the house with us, and they were getting closer. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed Eli's arm, pulling him toward the bathroom across the hall. We darted inside, closing the door as quietly as we could, the sound of the footsteps growing louder with every passing second. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back. We stood there, frozen, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped outside the bathroom door. And then came the knocking. A slow, deliberate knock that sent chills racing up my spine. Whoever was out there wasn't just walking around. They knew we were inside. The knock came again, harder this time, the door rattling in its frame. I glanced at Eli, his face pale and wide-eyed, the cocky grin long gone. "What do we do?" I mouthed, too afraid to make a sound. But Eli didn't answer. His gaze had shifted to the small window above the bathtub, the only way out. We didn't wait. Without a word, we scrambled for the window, pushing it open as the knocking turned into pounding. My heart raced as I hoisted myself up, my legs dangling out into the night air. Eli followed, his face twisted with fear, as the door behind us shook with each violent blow. And then we were outside, falling onto the soft grass below. I scrambled to my feet, my legs trembling as I grabbed Eli's arm, and we ran. We didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were halfway down the street, the house shrinking behind us. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, I turned to Eli. "Who the hell was that?" Eli shook his head, still trying to catch his breath. "I don't know, man. But that wasn't Savannah." We didn't talk much after that. We just kept walking, our nerves shot, our hands shaking. By the time we reached my house, the fireworks had long since stopped, and the town had settled into an uneasy silence. The next morning, guilt gnawed at me. We had broken into someone's house, and while I knew we hadn't meant to cause any real harm, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed a line. So I did what I thought was right. I went to the police. I told them everything. How Eli and I had snuck into Savannah's house, how we'd seen someone in her closet, how we'd been chased out by the sound of footsteps and pounding at the door. I expected them to be furious, maybe even arrest us for trespassing. But instead, they looked at me with a strange mixture of confusion and concern. "Are you sure you were at the Hughes' house?" the officer asked, leaning forward in his chair. I nodded. Positive. It was Savannah's house. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Son, we've already talked to the Hughes family. No one was home last night. Savannah and her parents were at a family barbecue across town. They didn't come back until well after midnight." "But," I stammered, "we saw someone. Eli saw someone in the closet." The officer frowned. "And you're sure about that?" I nodded, my throat dry. "There was no one there when we checked," he said, his voice low. "And the Hughes family said they don't know anyone who could have been in the house." A chill ran down my spine. If no one had been home, and if the police hadn't found anyone, then who or what had we seen in the closet? And who had been pounding on the bathroom door? I left the police station that day with more questions than answers, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Eli and I never spoke of that night again. Whatever we had seen, whatever had chased us out of Savannah's house, we didn't want to know. Some things were better left unexplored. But every now and then, I can't help but think about that night. The tall figure in the closet, the slow, deliberate footsteps, the pounding at the door. I wonder if maybe, just maybe, we weren't the only ones playing a prank that night. The story 6. The landlord knocked twice. The Hamptons had always been a place that felt out of reach for Casey and me. It was the sort of destination we heard about in stories, a luxurious retreat for people with more money than they knew what to do with. But we'd found a deal too good to pass up, a quaint cozy house on Airbnb nestled in a quiet corner not far from the beach. For a few days, we could pretend to be part of that world, to live in that dream, if only for a weekend. It was late July 2018, and the drive out from the city had been long but peaceful. The sun was setting by the time we reached the house, casting an orange glow over the tree-lined road as we pulled up. The house was everything we had imagined, small but charming, with white siding and dark green shutters, surrounded by thick, towering trees. The kind of house that felt secluded, peaceful. The air was cool with the smell of salt water drifting in from the nearby coast. We grabbed our bags from the trunk and made our way up the creaky porch steps, the wood soft beneath our feet as if it hadn't been properly maintained. Casey fumbled with the key from the lockbox, finally opening the door and pushing it wide, letting the scent of the house's age pour over us. It smelled faintly of damp wood, dust, and something I couldn't quite place. Maybe mildew from the sea air. The inside was simple. A modest kitchen, a living room with a couch and an old TV, and 2 small bedrooms. The windows were large, looking out onto a sprawling backyard filled with overgrown grass and wild flowers. The place had an eerie, forgotten charm to it, but nothing that raised any immediate alarm. I chalked the sense of unease up to our unfamiliar surroundings. "This is perfect," Casey said, tossing her bag onto the couch and turning to face me with a grin. A little rundown, but still, perfect. I smiled back, more to reassure myself than her. It was perfect, wasn't it? A break from our crowded, noisy life in the city. We spent the first night settling in. The power flickered once or twice, but the light stayed on, and the evening passed without incident. We cooked dinner, shared a bottle of wine, and sat outside on the porch, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. By the time we went to bed, I was convinced this trip would be exactly what we needed. It was sometime early the next morning when I first noticed it. I'd woken up just before dawn, still half asleep, and wandered into the kitchen to get some water. The house was dim, the pale light of the early morning filtering in through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. I was filling my glass at the sink when I saw it. A figure. A shadow, quick but unmistakable, moving across the window at the far end of the living room. At first, I thought it was just my tired brain playing tricks on me. I blinked, staring out into the backyard, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, but no one was there. Still, my skin prickled, a cold sensation creeping up my spine. I set the glass down and walked slowly to the window, peering out into the early morning light. The backyard was empty. No movement, no sound, just the trees standing tall and silent. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. I was still groggy from sleep, still adjusting to the quiet of the place. But the unease lingered, settling deep in my chest as I stood there, staring out at the yard. When Casey woke up later that morning, I didn't mention it. There was no reason to, I thought. It was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me. The day passed in a blur of beach visits and leisurely walks around the small town. We explored the shops, had lunch by the water, and relaxed in the summer sun. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake that feeling from earlier. It gnawed at me, a nagging sensation that something was off, like I was being watched. It wasn't until we got back to the house that evening that things began to unravel. We'd been back for maybe an hour when the power went out. One moment, we were sitting on the couch, talking about where we might go for dinner, and the next, the lights blinked off, plunging the room into darkness. Casey sat up, frowning. Did the power just go out? I nodded, my heart starting to race. It wasn't just the lights. The hum of the fridge had stopped. The soft whir of the air conditioner had gone silent. The entire house was dead. I stood up, grabbing my phone to use as a flashlight. I'll check the breaker box, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I made my way through the house, the narrow beam of my phone light casting strange, jagged shadows on the walls. The air felt different, heavier, more oppressive. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in my bones. As I reached the back of the house, I heard it. A voice. Faint at first, but growing louder as I approached the door. I'm the landlord, the voice called from outside. I came to fix the power. My hand froze on the doorknob. Something about the voice sent a shiver down my spine. It was too calm, too deliberate, and we hadn't called anyone. We hadn't even contacted the host about the outage yet. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The power had gone out, and then, suddenly, there was a man outside claiming to be the landlord, here to fix it. It didn't add up. I'll get the door, Casey called from the living room, but I rushed back, stopping her before she could reach the front entrance. Wait, I said, my voice low. Something's not right. What do you mean? Casey asked, confusion clouding her face. If he's the landlord. We didn't call anyone, I whispered. How would he know the power went out? Casey hesitated, her eyes widening slightly as the realization hit. She took a step back, her gaze flicking toward the door. The man outside knocked again, harder this time. I'm here to fix the power, he repeated, his voice sharper now, more insistent. I locked the door, my heart pounding in my chest. We should call the police, I said, pulling out my phone with shaking hands. Casey nodded, backing away from the door as the knocking grew louder, more forceful. The entire door frame shook with each pound, the sound echoing through the quiet house. I dialed 911, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. There's a man outside, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. He says he's the landlord, but we didn't call anyone. He's trying to get in. The dispatcher's voice was calm, too calm, as she told me to stay put, and that an officer would be there as soon as possible. But we were far from town, and I knew it would take time for anyone to reach us. Meanwhile, the man outside was growing more aggressive. The knocking had turned into banging, the door rattling violently in its frame. I could hear him muttering now, his voice muffled but angry. Every few seconds, he'd slam his fist against the door, harder and harder. Casey grabbed my arm, her face pale. What if he gets in? I didn't have an answer. The police were on their way, but that didn't mean he wouldn't break down the door before they got here. The thought of being trapped in this house with some stranger, some man who had been lurking outside in the dark, sent a wave of terror crashing over me. We just need to hold on, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. The police will be here soon. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an hour. The man outside continued to pound on the door, shouting now, demanding to be let in. His voice was raw, desperate, but there was something in it, something cold, calculated, like he knew exactly what he was doing. I glanced at Casey, her face illuminated by the dim light of my phone. She was terrified, and so was I. But we couldn't let him in. We couldn't. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The man stopped banging on the door, his voice falling silent. I held my breath, listening as the sirens grew closer, louder. There was a final deafening bang on the door, and then nothing. Silence. the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. A few moments later, there was a knock, but this time it was different. A quick, professional rap. "Police," a voice called out. I opened the door, my legs shaking beneath me. Two officers stood on the porch, their flashlights sweeping the area. "He's gone," I stammered, glancing nervously around. "He was just here." The officers nodded, stepping inside. They searched the house, the yard, the surrounding area, but there was no sign of the man. It was as if he had vanished the moment the sirens approached. One of the officers took our statements while the other continued to search the property. Casey was still trembling, her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted what had happened. "Whoever it was," the officer said, his tone serious, "they won't be bothering you anymore. We'll make sure of it." But as they left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. Something had been lurking outside that house, something dangerous. And even though the police were gone, the terror of that night lingered. Casey and I left the Airbnb the next morning, cutting our trip short. We didn't talk much during the drive back to the city. There was nothing to say. But every now and then, when the lights flicker, or I hear a knock at the door late at night, I can still hear that voice. "I'm here to fix the power,"